Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for just giving us this new week. Thank you for this opportunity just to come together and spend time in worship and in fellowship and open your word. And God, I ask that you would just bless the reading of your word this morning. I thank you for the word that I believe that you've given me for our church, and I just ask that you would just use it in a mighty way. And I just pray that each one of us would be open to receive whatever you have for us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So my name is Joshua, if I haven't got the chance to meet you yet. And I wanted to start out, I wanted to share a story with you guys. When I was going to school out in California, when I was going to college out there, I had this kind of tradition that I did for a couple years. Every year around Thanksgiving time, I would make it a special point to come home back to Colorado for Thanksgiving. And so I'd grab a couple friends, and we'd load up the car and road trip back to Colorado. And I remember just pulling into the driveway and seeing the lights in the house, and just kind of had this feeling that no matter where I went and the things I did and how far away I got, that I was home, and that certain things in life they just never change. And so Connection Church has kind of been one of those fixed points in my life for me. It's been I've been here for close to 5 years now, and it's been just a great family for me to grow in, and so it really is a privilege to be up here and to get to share with you guys this morning. One of the reasons why I share that story is because I think we all kind of have a sense of longing for home in us. And, regardless of what you believe and where you are, I think that's just something that's just instinctual in us. And that kind of ties in with what we're going to talk about today. And I think it points to a deeper truth, which is that ultimately we aren't home yet, and that longing that's inside of us points to the fact that we're a people that are waiting and longing for home. So we're going to look at a couple stories about some guys from the Bible that had that sense of longing and waiting for home and expecting. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Hebrews 11. That's where we're going to be at for most of this morning. And several months ago, I was reading through Hebrews 11, and it's sometimes called the Hall of Faith. There's just a list of men and women that are put in there as examples for us of our faith, and kind of heroes of the faith. And so I was just going through and asking the question, what makes these people so special? Why are they set apart as examples for us? And part of what I came to was that they had a sense of something that was already but not yet. It was they could see it, but it just hadn't happened yet. And so, reading from Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 1, this just kind of sets the tone for. We're going to look at Abraham, and we're going to look at Moses. So, starting out, chapter 11, verse 1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. In verse 1, I'm reading out of the New King James. In the NASB, it says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. So you kind of get this sense that faith is something that we're expecting and that we're waiting for, and that just hasn't, maybe it hasn't been fulfilled yet. And then, kind of just an example of that, when I speak into the microphone, I obviously can't see the sound waves going through and coming through the speakers, but I expect when I speak into the microphone that it's going to come through the speakers and you guys are going to be able to hear me. So that's kind of just a really simple example of we use faith every day. And then in verse 3 it says, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen, which were not made of things which are visible. So by this definition, the worlds that when the world was made, none of us were there, obviously, and so regardless of what you believe, it takes faith to believe it. Whether you believe that God created the universe and everything in it, or whether you believe He didn't, it takes some amount of faith to believe what you believe. So that just kind of sets the tone and the context for faith. Jumping down to verse 6 in chapter 11, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. I have those two words underlined in my Bible. He is. And remember that, because it'll be important later. He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. We serve and seek a God that is knowable. That He's not an unknown God. He wants to be known, and He wants to know us on a very personal level. And I think that's one of the things that separates God and the God of the Bible from almost every major religion out there, is that He seeks us and He sought us where we were at, and we have the opportunity to know Him. So we're going to look at the story of Abraham. So skipping down to verse 8 of chapter 11. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place where he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Pause there real quick. I love that verse. I pulled it up in the Amplified, and it says, he was waiting expectantly and confidently, looking forward to the city which has foundations, an eternal heavenly city, whose architect and builder is God. Gosh, I think that speaks to where we're at as a church, as kind of in a season of waiting and expecting and maybe not knowing exactly what's going to be next for us. But I think that's just a reminder of what we're not waiting for a building or a pastor in a big sense. We're waiting for the fulfillment of God's kingdom. So moving on in verse 11, by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So you get this sense that Abraham kind of got this vision, and he was waiting and expecting something. So what I want to do is go back just to provide a little more context for Abraham's story. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 15, and look at just a little bit more of his story. And so while you're turning there, just a little further context from Genesis 15. Abraham was called by God. He was chosen by God to leave the people and the land that he grew up with and where his family was, and go out and follow God's calling on his life. And God promised him when he was 75 years old, he promised him that he would build a great nation out of him, and ultimately that would become the bloodline of Christ, would come from Abraham. And so he leaves his people, and he sets out. He has this call on his life that God's going to give him a land and a nation from his bloodline. And it wasn't for another 25 years before he even had that son that was promised. So he was 75 when he got the promise. He was 100 when it was fulfilled, when he had the son, and his wife Sarah was about 90. And so there was a long season of waiting in between when he got the promise and when it was fulfilled. And so picking up in chapter 15, starting in verse 3, Abraham is questioning God, that God is going to come through on the promise that he has for him. And I love that when you do a study of all these different people in Hebrews 11 that are mentioned as great men and women of faith, that they don't skip, the Bible doesn't skip over their doubts and their questions and their mistakes. And so you get the sense that they're real people, just like us. So starting in verse 3, chapter 11 of Genesis, then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven, and count the stars if you are able to number them." And he said, So shall your descendants be. And I think God has a habit of taking us off of our circumstances, taking our eyes off of our circumstances and onto Him. And I think the Bible places specific emphasis on our eyes and where we set our eyes and what we're looking to. And the example of Noah, looking up to the rainbow as a reminder of God's promise. Matthew 6:22 says the eye, let's see, what is it? The lamp of the body is the eye. And then the psalmist says, I lift my eyes to the hills where my help comes from. So there's this kind of repetitiveness of getting our eyes off of ourselves and our circumstances and off of ourselves and onto Him. And so I want to go back. Let's jump back to Hebrews 11. And we're going to pick up back in verse 13. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. These all died in faith. Speaking of the people mentioned in Hebrews 11. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. The NASB says they welcomed them. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So again, you get this sense that they were waiting, that they saw something that the people around them didn't see. They had a vision and an expectation of what was to come. We're gonna look at Moses. So same chapter, moving down to verse 23. It says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." You notice the pattern that keeps coming up is what we're looking to in the invisible. He endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. So, to provide context for Moses' story, he was born of the Jewish bloodline, but he was raised in the kingdom of Pharaoh. So he had the bloodline of the Jews, but he was raised in prestige and posh. And when you read the story of Moses, you get a sense, even from early on, that there was a very specific calling on his life. And so during his life, he starts kind of running from the calling that God placed on his life. And so he leaves Egypt, he leaves his people, he goes to wander in the wilderness, and he's just kind of, if you've seen the movie or read the story, obviously reading the story in the Bible is probably better, but if you read the story, you find him there and you're like, come on, dude, your people need you. What are you doing out there in the wilderness? And so, where we're gonna pick up the story is where God finds him. He's out in the wilderness, and he's tending flocks and doing his ranching stuff and all that. And God finds him and meets him where he's at. So, you guys probably already there. I'm going to get there. We're going to go to Exodus, I think it's chapter 3. Yep, Exodus chapter 3. So this is kind of a long one. I think we're just going to read through the whole thing, so bear with me. Exodus 3, verse 1. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came back to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. So he's in the wilderness, he's tending the flocks, and I've never been a rancher or a farmer, but I go hunting, and part of that is scouting. And so when you're out there, whether you're looking for coyotes or elk or whatever, your eyes are constantly on the horizon, and bushes and weeds, and I've actually confused a bunch of bushes for a herd of elk before. When you look out and you see them, it's just, they're common, they're everywhere. And so I get this sense when he's out there and he's looking on the horizon, and he lives his life in the bushes and in the weeds and on the plains. And so he sees this bush, and it's burning. And to me, there's kind of an emphasis on the common and the profound. And I was talking to Troy yesterday about this. It was just how, back then fire was a big deal, just like it is today. It draws us. And so you have a bush, which, it's just a bush, but it's on fire. And he, at that point, who knows what it was going through his head, but he sees it, and he decides that he needs to investigate, figure out what it is. And so, to me, that's just kind of cool that God, he could have shown up, I would have shown up in a ball of fire, but he chose to use the common and meet him where he was at. So, picking up in verse 3, then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. And to me, and that was in the movie, that was always my favorite part of the movie, when he finds the bush and he sees him, and Moses, he's looking and he goes to investigate, and then you get this idea that he recognizes that something bigger is happening here, that this isn't just an ordinary circumstance. And so he's asked to take off his sandals because the ground that he stands on is holy ground. And last week, the speaker was talking about expectation, revelation, transformation. Hey, he was listening. Good. Expectation, alteration, transformation? No, revelation. Then transformation. Okay. Okay. So he saw it. He was expecting, and he gets this revelation that something bigger is happening. So picking up back in verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon him. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry, because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up for the land, to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites, Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed me. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And this is kind of what these next few verses are what I want us to really clue in on. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go out to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he sees it, he hides his face, and then he asks, man, who am I? Who am I that, that I'm worthy or that I can be called to a task like this? And it's cool because God doesn't immediately answer his question. He asks, who am I? And then starting back in verse 12, his answer to him isn't an answer to the question that he asked. So he said, God, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So when I was reading this, I underlined that because I realized the sign that he gave to him was something that was going to come to pass after the promise was fulfilled. So the sign was something that he was to look for and to be expecting, but he wasn't going to see the fulfillment of the sign until the promise was fulfilled. So, because it says, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So it took faith for him to believe that God was going to fulfill the promise, and he really gives just a promise with another promise. And kind of the idea that he's like, you have to wait, you have to trust me, and trust that I'm going to come through. Going back to verse 13, it says, Then Moses said to God, Indeed, when I am come to the children of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? So again, Moses, he's doubting, he's questioning, he feels he's unworthy, and he asks God again. And this is kind of where God shuts him down and actually answers his question. Verse 14, And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So Moses asks, who am I? Who am I to go? God gives him the sign, and then he finally answers the question. He says, No, you're asking the wrong question. It's not who am I? It's not who are you? It's who am I? And he says, I am who I am. And back in Hebrews chapter 11, that was chapter verse 6. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of him who diligently seek him. And I think that's pretty much what it boils down to right there. When we're looking and seeking and expecting God to move, it's not about looking to ourselves for strength or the fulfillment of the promise. I think God has to get our eyes off of ourselves and kind of up onto him and recognize that he is the fulfillment of the promise. I wanted to share a story with you guys, a personal story of God's faithfulness in my own life. And back in 2016, I was going through just a really tough time in my life, and frustrated with myself, and frustrated with my faith, and if I was honest with myself, I wasn't growing, and I wasn't moving forward. And I remember one day sitting down with my dad and just saying, "Man, sometimes it just doesn't feel like it's worth fighting anymore. I just feel like I keep falling down and messing up and doing the same thing day in and day out." And it got to a point where I was starting to question and ask, if my faith doesn't have the power to change me, is my salvation real? And I remember also sitting down with Zach and having a similar conversation back at that time. But one morning I remember waking up, and I was just feeling down, and I kind of felt like I had this choice in front of me. I felt like I could either pull the covers back over my head and kind of forget all the responsibilities and what was going on in the outside world, and choose to be passive and not engage. Or I could take some sort of action. And at that time I didn't know what it looked like or what it was going to be, but I kind of got a sense that that it was going to involve talking to someone. And so a few weeks later, Brad Thomas asked me if I wanted to meet with him on a regular basis and just kind of talk through life. And so starting back then in 2016, we started meeting on a regular basis and just kind of sharing our stories and what we were going through. And it's funny because I think a lot of times we have these ideas that are up in our heads that just kind of bounce around up there for so long that they become concrete and they affect the way that we live. And there's been just sometimes it's just a phrase or a word that you hear, and rather than actually engaging the idea, it just kind of gets stored up there. And so I think something happens when you talk with someone and when you verbalize it, because the thing becomes something that you can actually look at and intellectually engage and ask if it's true. And so part of that for me was just voicing some of those things and getting them out there so that I could actually ask, are these things real? What do I do with them? What do I do with these feelings that have kind of been just bogging me down for so long? And the second thing that God used during that time was a place that I like to go to just get away and reflect. And I've always had, well, probably since late high school, going into college, I've always had a place that I'd find to kind of get away and just organize my thoughts, really. And it was usually something that I would do when I had a lot of questions and when I was asking and when I needed to find peace. And what God did over that time period in 2016 and kind of moving into 2017 was that time started to become really real to me. And it started to become less of an obligation and something that I just did because I have to, and something that I actually wanted to do. And it wasn't so much a time of me talking and speaking to God, but more of just listening. And I would go out there, and I just have this sense that as I would pray and listen for God, that the things that were happening all around me, my circumstances, just kind of had a way of shrinking down in my mind, and I was able to recognize what was actually real and important to me. And I think I didn't know if I was going to share this or not, but I read this. We looked at this during winter camp, and it's a quote from Louis Giglio. It's something he says during his indescribable tour. I just love it. It says, "Sin has a way of shrinking down God in our minds and puffing us up in our own estimation. But just a glance into the universe that God has made resizes everything in a heartbeat.
But I'll tell you, the miracle of tonight is crazy and crazier to me than the size of any star. And it's though we are but a vapor, you and me, and tiny and frail. We are marked by majesty. And we have been created in the very image of the God who breathes out the stars and puts the universe into place. You and I are fashioned and formed and ordained by the God of all creation. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. That when I read that and just kind of reflect on my story, that it becomes very, very real to me. And I wanted to share a picture with you guys that I came across at one point when I was growing up. We used to go over to my grandparents' house and read. There was a ton of comic books. So we'd read. One of my favorites was Calvin and Hobbes, and there's this picture that I think sometimes in pop culture we come across something that is just a nugget, something that somebody wrote down, and maybe they didn't even know God, but you realize after that there's a sense of the divine there. And so if you want to pull up that picture. So that if people sat outside and looked at the stars each night, I bet they'd live a lot differently. And to be, we're so busy. There's so much noise in our life, and everything's 100 miles an hour and right now. And I think when we don't take time to slow down and actually ask the questions that are burning on our heart, I think we miss something. To me, the whole idea of faith and expectation, I don't think faith is something that necessarily we have in and of ourselves that moves God. I think faith is an expectation that God is going to come through on who He says He is, and it's not something that moves God in a sense. But I think really what it does is it positions our hearts to where we're seeking and we're waiting for God to come through on His promise. And I think the idea of expecting things from God is so valuable. And part of that, like for myself, if I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't, but what I like to do if I can't go back to sleep is either go for a walk or open up my Bible. And it's amazing how during that time I almost always get some nugget, something profound. And I think part of that is because to me it's like, okay, if I'm up at 3 a.m., seeking God, I better find something. I better get something. And I think that expectation, it doesn't force God's hand in any sense, but I think it just positions our hearts to where we're expecting God to come through on His promises. So, Troy and the worship band, you guys can come up if you want. Some closing thoughts for you guys, and some things I want to just leave with you and have you guys asking during the week. is for one, you have to know that God's faithful. You have to seek Him and believe that and ask, what are the times in my life that God has been faithful? And if you you don't have those experiences, seek God and ask Him to come through on His promises. And the second thing is that I think one of the reasons why we share our stories is because we're all different, but God works with each of us in a lot of the same ways. And one of the things that I wrote down when I was studying for this, and I think it just kind of speaks to that element of the story, is God's grace intersects perfectly with your story. It's not going to work. It's not going to work in the exact same way as it did for me, that it did for you, but it's going to work. And I think that's what's cool about getting the chance to encourage each other with each other's stories, is that it kind of brings that into focus. And then the third thing that I want to leave you guys with is that I think we get an idea that doubt and questions are a negative thing, and I feel like we don't create enough space in the church for good questions and honest doubt, and that it's almost like there's a stigma of if you don't have all the answers, there's something wrong with you. And for me, if you have those questions burning in you and doubts, there's two things that you can do with them. One is to bury them and hide them, and never have them answered. And the second is to run to God and to say, God, in all these questions and wonderings, I'm not gonna stop. I'm not going to stop seeking you until I find you. So that's my prayer for us and for this church, is that we would be a people that doesn't stop seeking until we find Him. So we're gonna close out with a song. If you guys would stand with us in worship.